And this is kind of our objectives of what we're going to talk about. Uh, what is compost? How does it happen? Its function and life, its effects on soil. How does it happen? Materials to use and avoid, methods and equipment. And I'll show you some examples from the Bellevue Demo Garden where I've been participating. It's actually 22 years now. And then I'll show you my personal methods I live in Seattle by Children's Orthopedic Hospital, and I have a small garden there. And then I have 2/3 of an acre of a garden on a small island in the middle of American Lake. And Fort Lewis owns half of American Lake. So I'll show you that. And at the end, I'll show you some of the ways I do kitchen scraps. So you want to decide if you want to believe anything I tell you. I was a chemical engineer for 9 years, and I didn't want to leave the Northwest, so I switched careers and became a dentist. And I taught part-time at the university for 43 years. And when I retired, I took the Master Gardener class. And I find I learned things better by doing them. So I became a member of the demonstration garden in Bellevue, where I've done the composting for most of those years. I've had edible flowers, a brassica. I currently have an artichoke and asparagus bed. I also have a hydrangea bed because the women that were doing that didn't continue. And I usually had an experimental bed, but I haven't done any of that for several years. And I already told you about the rest. So this is how most people compost, and it works fine. And you may decide to do that after you hear this also. So what is compost? Compost is a mixture of organic materials in various stages of decomposition. And the material you start with and the stage you use in it and how you apply it make a big difference. You can use it as a mulch, which is what I primarily do in my garden. And it's best in its early stages. And in my case, I have a perennial. I'm in a fir forest. If you look behind my head in my picture there, you'll see where I garden in there. And mulch in this stage is something you can't buy when you're making it yourself. In a perennial bed, it's primarily a fungal-based system. You really don't want to disturb your soil, because if you disturb it, you interrupt those fungal things that enable you to bring nutrients from quite a distance away, and that includes moisture. So you want to fertilize a perennial bed from the surface only. You don't want to dig into it. And compost, as most people buy it, works best as a soil amendment, which is way you would use things in a vegetable bed, which is a bacterial-based system where you're going to disturb it every year when you build it up and it doesn't have a chance to build a fungal base. And that's the stage that you normally buy compost in there. And it works very well to improve your soil biology. It also improves drainage and fertility. If you send it to the yard waste, mostly at Cedar Grove in King County, you will buy back a sterile product. They heat their material to at least 150 degrees. When you make your own compost, you'll never get much above 100 degrees. So you're going to have anything that was growing in there still growing in there when you get done. So it is a little bit of a problem if you're not a regular gardener to maintain weeds if you're making your own. So what is the function of compost? It's the life of the soil. Without compost, you only have dirt. It's the non-organic part of your garden. And compost enables the microorganisms that are in it to change the chemicals that are already in the soil to a useful form. It stores the positive ions and enhances fertilizer availability. It compensates for over fertilizing, which a lot of people do. However, it has a minimal effect on negative ions. It decreases compaction. It provides for drainage and retention of water. It feeds the fungus that improve your structure in your soil if you're doing this for a perennial bed. And if you're doing kitchen wastes, it'll typically have an NPK, which is the things that you see when you buy a fertilizer package, of about 1% of all those, or a little bit higher. I've seen Tegro, which is the product you get from the Tacoma sewage treatment system, somewhere between 3 and 6%. And Groco, which comes from the King County systems, it'll have a similar content, depending upon the time of the year. Well, what do you want to know about your soil to start with? Is its soil texture, and the soil texture is the percentage of the sand, silt, and clay. If you start out with a big rock and you roll it downhill, little pieces fall off, and water and air and volcanic eruptions will push that rock further down the hill. Well, depending upon where you are in that stream system, the big rocks drop out first and the small ones drop out last. So if you're in King County, you probably have something in the really high sand category. If you're in the Skagit Valley, where they grow all the really nice tulips, and all this clay is dropped out of the soil in there, you'll have a clay loam. And if you look at a sandy mixture, sand has about 11 centimeters of surface area per gram, where silt has about 100 times that much, and clay has another 100. So you're going to get a very large increase in your surface areas to hold on to these nutrients that are in your garden. Well, the other reason you want to know what your soil texture is that if you have this sandy loam garden, which the bulk of King County has. I took a class at Seattle Community College, and there were 26 people in that class, and every one of them had a sandy loam. None of them had a clay loam. However, I have friends that are in Federal Way that do have a clay loam. So you could have a clay loam, but that's not too likely. But if you have this kind of a sandy loam system, and you put a small hole in it and fill that full of water, within 15 minutes, that water will be down about a foot, which is about the root zone of most plants that we have. However, if you have a sandy loam and you do the same thing, it'll take 4 hours and it'll still be down only 2 feet, and it'll be all that water will be retained within the root zone of your material. So if you are using a drip irrigation system with a sandy loam, you want to have your drip irrigation system close together. You want to water for a very short time and very frequently. If you're in a sandy loam system, you want to put your drip systems farther apart, and you want to water not very often, but fairly deeply, because in 4 hours, almost all your water is going to still be within the root zone. However, if you take and add compost to this sandy loam system, you will move it in the direction of the clay loam, which is ideally what you would do. And unfortunately, you don't do anything to this area that's 2 feet or lower, and so it's never going to reach this, no matter how much compost you add, but it'll still be enough to have an adequate system. The compost that you're going to have is made up of about up to 5% living material. You have another up to maybe 10% that's dead material. then you have between 20 and 45% of the material that's in an actively decomposing uh, mode. And when it's actively decomposing, the people that are working on that are these microscopic bacteria primarily, and they're mobile. They can go around and pick up what they want, but they don't leave much for your plants. So you don't want to use actively decomposing materials to fertilize with, because it's not available to your plants. Eventually it'll break down into what's called humus, and that's 50 to 80% of what compost is. And if you're into this category, you can use the whole mix, and it will work fine, because humus is going to improve your soil structure. That's the way it binds together and holds things. It'll improve both your air and your water infiltration and the movement within it. It'll improve the water retention and the ability to release it to the plants when they need it. It'll slowly release the nitrogen and the phosphorus and the sulfur over time, phosphorus and sulfur in the positive ion range. And it will improve your soil vitality, because the positive ions are able to stick to the compost. It'll buffer your pH so that the range of the materials will stay within the range. You may have to correct your pH, but when you correct it, it'll stay there better. And if you use humus in there, it will attract and bind metals. That can be a positive or a negative. It keeps it in there so that when it's released to the water table, it's at a less invasive material. However, if you have some products, it could be picked up in there and grown. I just saw some information where if you're growing cannabis, it's held very well by those materials. So you might not want to be smoking it if you're using those. So if you're making compost, most of what you're going to make is going to occur in this low up to 104-degree temperature. If you get the pile up about a cubic foot or bigger, then the temperature will increase. And if you have this particle size fairly small, so more bacteria can get at the surface, then it'll get up into that 104 to 131. And I've actually had the Bellevue demo garden at over 131 degrees for 2 weeks, but you have to turn it really often to make it happen. When it gets above about 150 degrees, most of those bacteria tend to die off and it becomes sterile. It still becomes a very good product. It's got all the nutrients you want in there. It's just you don't have the biology that's alive to work in there. So when you put compost in your yard, you're relying on the bacteria that's already there to feed on what you just gave them. Eventually it'll cool down and you'll start to see all the other items that fall into it. So in the first two stages, the temperature ranges, it's being broken down and it's heating up the pile. In the third stage, you'll start to see the mites and the more visible things that are in the garden, and almost all of those will be beneficial. The centipedes, ants, beetles, all those things are good. You'll see the red worms and all those that come into it. If you turn it and it gets hot again, most of those organisms will leave as it heats up. They don't like the heat, or they'll die if they don't get out of the way. For optimum speed, getting it as quick as you want to have a ratio of carbon to nitrogen of somewhere around 30 to 1. And if you look at a pile, if it's a brown material, the chances are that's a carbon part. If it's green, then it's probably a nitrogen product. However, coffee grounds are brown in color, but they're very high in nitrogen. So if you want to heat up your pile, you can use coffee grounds. That works pretty well. And then you want to have a mass that's more than a cubic foot. If you take a pile of leaves alone and just put them into a pile, and then to go out the next day and put your hand in the pile, it'll be warm. It heats up. However, you don't want to use a single material that it will not work as well as if you have a mixture of materials. So you want to use the things that leave air volume spaces in there. When you have a larger pile, it accelerates, but it needs air and water, because as the air and water use up the space, it compacts, and they'll become dormant. But if you just open up the spaces by turn it'll increase in its speed again. If you use it as a soil amendment before it's complete, as I said before, it will not work as well as if you wait till it's reached the humus stage. But a bigger pile and a smaller particle are a way to increase your speed. But speed doesn't make any difference. The product's the same, whether you do it quickly or not. So now that we've got our compost, so we have an option to make it. If you don't want to make your own, you can buy back what you gave to the Clean Green from Cedar Grove, or you can buy biosolids from one of the treatment plants, Groco in the north end and Tegro in the south end. Those products are tested. You can see what's in them and know what you're getting. Another option is to buy farm animal byproducts. There's quite a few zoos that sell those animals waste as fundraisers also. However, most of these products are rarely tested, and a lot of farm animals are fed antibiotics and hormones, which will end up in the product. So you kind of want to know where you're getting your material from, because it's not tested. And if you're using it for root crops, then I'd be kind of hesitant to say that which ones to use in there. However, if you decide you want to make your own because you know what the materials are, there's a series of bin types that we have at the Bellevue Demo Garden, and I'm going to show you examples of those and how you would harvest from the materials you have there. Another option to make your own is called sheet composting, where you take your clippings for the materials and you cut it up into relatively short size, and you just pile it back on the ground where it started. And I do that in the winter a lot when I'm things like fuchsias that are root hardy, but the tops are going to die anyway. You cut them off. That insulates that soil, and it eliminates light so weeds don't grow as well, and it'll break down. And if it doesn't completely break down, you can rake it off in the spring and put it in your compost pile. Or more than likely, what I do is I run it through a chipper shredder in there. Either way, they're going to provide an increase in soil biology. The other option is to just put it on the ground and let it happen. You don't need to worry about the ratio it's going to happen. It just takes longer if it's not. You can also just cut and drop it. If you're cutting your lawn and you don't rake up the cuttings, it will break down, and you'll need about a third less fertilizer if you do that also. And of course, the other option is to just send it to the yard waste. Some things you might want to consider how you use them is if you have dogs or waste from other meat eaters, it's best not to use those for root crops. Those animals could have parasites, and you don't get it hot enough to kill them off. So I would, in general, tell you to send that to the Cedar Grove, where they heat it high enough to get rid of it. If you have invasive plants like ivy or bindweed, blackberries, plants that send out roots at every leaf node, like lamnium, there's some I like, but there's some that I don't. I bought some lamnium years ago, and I'm still trying to get rid of them. So you don't want to compost those kind of materials. Buttercups and anemone are in that category also. If you have fibrous or tough things or that retain a lot of moisture. And I have in mind beans, peas, squash, and iris. They're tough, hard to cut up. And if you try to run them through a chipper shredder when they're still have moisture in them, they jam up the pressure. So you want to let those desiccate pretty well before you try to run them through a chipper shredder or throw them in the waste that goes to Cedar Grove. Another source of compost is the people who trim trees for power lines and that kind of thing. Asplin is a big company in ours. If you just ask them if they will deliver it, they typically will give you whatever they got. But so you need to be prepared to get 5 or 10 yards or more of the material. Most of that works really well as a mulch. However, if it's walnut trees or chestnuts or eucalyptus, I would tell you to let it compost really well because it could slow things down as a soil amendment. And the other product that you want to be careful using is wood ash. It's high in potassium, but unless you have a soil test that says you need potassium, you want to be careful using it. And if it has treated wood or painted wood, those will end up in your compost, and that it's in general it's not considered organic. Compost life is fairly short. It's something up to a year in general. However, you need between 3 and 7% in an ideal soil. And in our area where we have relatively wet winters, you want to be on the high side of that. Compost improves your cation exchange capacity. And if you have a soil test, they will tell you how much organic material you have in there and typically tell you how to adjust your compost in order to improve. It's possible you have too much also. But it gets used up pretty much in a year's time. So you need to add compost every year. Whether you buy it or make it yourself, it's going to be the same. The closer to the surface compost is, it'll have more air and it'll disappear faster. So if you only put in an inch of material over your garden, it's going to disappear faster than if you put 3 inches in, because it's going to be further from the surface in there. If you use a lot of compost, it's going to bind up your fertilizer and you're going to have to use more fertilizer to get the same equivalent. So when you do that soil test and it tells you what your cation exchange capacity is, that'll give you an indication of whether you have too much or not. And I suggest you do that. The more you turn your compost or turn the soil that it's in, the faster your compost will disappear. In vegetable soils, you're going to add it to the soil every year. So that's not a big factor. If you're in a perennial bed, you want to apply it as a mulch, and the thickness you apply will somewhat determine how long it takes to disappear. But adding it to the perennial bed will benefit both your soil moisture, soil temperature retention, and weed control if you make it thick enough. At the Bellevue demonstration garden, which you're looking at in the screen now, we have a series of different kinds of bins. And most people bring back their material where they've clipped it up with their clippers. But if they don't, I have a butcher block and a machete that I use to chop it up. However, a machete is used for chopping in air, and I don't recommend that because it's really hard on your arm if you're just starting. But so, anyway, you need to clip up the material so the material is small, and you want to get the material to it's in the consistency of a wet sponge, and that'll be in the first stage, it's got enough volume for air to be in it, and then you put it in a bin and let it happen. At the Bellevue Demo Garden, we have what's called a 3-bin system, and you're looking at 2 of the bins, and then you see an empty bin on the right there. What I do is I put material in there and I build it up to where it's above the top of the bin here, and and I watered that with a hose, and then I put coffee sacks over it to kind of eliminate light. And we're there typically 2 days a week. If I did this on a Wednesday and I came back on a Saturday, this pile would be down almost even with it because it composts fairly quickly at the start. So what I would do then is I would move this center bin into the empty bin on the right and move these boards over at the same time. And I would move this bin over into the middle bin, leaving this one empty in there. And then, oh, let me go back to that. I have a cover over this, so if it's going to rain, I would cover it. Or if I need water, I would leave it open. In the summer, I usually leave it open because we need water on it. I will wet this with a hose in order to give it water. While I'm moving that from one bin to the other, I put it through I put it in a screen, and what doesn't screen off, I put in the bin, and what goes through, I use as a soil amendment later. This is fine. It doesn't work well as a mulch. It works fine as a soil amendment. And since we're a vegetable garden, that's how we would mostly use it. But if I'm not going to use it right away, I put it in a bin and cover it with a coffee sack in there. And that's how we use it. Usually in a vegetable garden, you're going to add compost at least a month before you're going to plant, or you're going to put it in there when you put your cover crop on it in the fall. If you're going to make it in a bin, you want to have a bin that has small holes so you can keep critters from getting into it, that has an ease of putting it in and taking it out. This bin on the left has a top on it where you put it in, and it has a door on the bottom. However, access to this doesn't let you get much out of it, and the holes are too wide. It lets varmints get through it. But you need the holes for air and water to come in or out as it's happening. This other bin is a stackable bin. You have 3 1-foot sections, and if you needed to turn it, you would shovel out the material that's in the first part onto the ground, and you would put this over that, and then you would shovel the next one into there and then put this on it. So you're just moving the pile over to the next space over. So you need space next to them if you're going to use that one. This bin has a top, but it doesn't have a bottom, and that lets critters crawl in from the outside through the bottom. And these critters will, compost has both warmth, food, and shelter, and that's a good place for home. And they'll set up, and you'll see these guys in there. I took this picture in one of our bins there. Another option, which is pretty critter proof, are these rotating bins. And this one was designed to place a wheelbarrow underneath it. You take off this door and put a screen on there, and when you rotate it, it drops out and does the same thing. This works fairly well if you don't put it in the sun, because the sun will heat this up and you'll lose your water fairly quickly. But the handle is about 20 turns of this to turn this once. And if you get it so it rotates up about a third of the way or half a way, and let go of the handle, it spins around really fast. So it's almost a dangerous way to do it. And typically, I don't recommend you use this bin, although they were highly advertised. Another option, if you're doing kitchen waste, these smaller ones work fairly well. If they have a single one, you have to sort of stop adding with it before you end up, or you'll end up having to take it and put it in the ground. There's another one where you have the one where you can fill it up and it's full. You stop using it and just turn it and then fill this one in. And then this one you could take. Either way, these work all right for kitchen waste, where you're probably going to only recover it probably once a year. If you have a garden like I have and you're using a chipper shredder, you can make a fairly good pile in a relatively short time. And if you go in at 24 hours later and put your hand in there, this will be quite warm and it'll be all white in color. It'll be working pretty well. This is a material that I typically use as a soil mulch. You would not use this as a soil amendment at that point. In order to chip this up, you need to keep it dry so that it won't jam in the chipper shredder. And I usually put a tarp on it and do it. These are hydrangeas that I've trimmed in there, and some of these are evergreen that I've caught in there. And this material, I would either use it as a mulch, or I would just store it until I need it as a mulch. Most of the time, I will put this on. My major chipping periods are either in the spring after I've let it dry out, or in the fall after I've let the summer parts dry out. If you are not able to send it to yard waste, then you want to make sure it's dead before you chip it up. Or if you did chip it up earlier, you want to let it sit so where it desiccates and dries out. And these are the chippers that I use. I had a 5 horsepower one, which was a high maintenance machine, and it eventually died where it wasn't worth fixing. And so I bought an electric 7 horsepower one, which works fine. It's still high maintenance, and I'm not so sure that owning one of these is cost effective. This is another one. I have 2 of these. I have one of these in Seattle and one of these at the garden. It's an MDT, and I looked, and I don't think they make it now, but they're readily sold on eBay in those, and it's a little less maintenance, but it's not there. This one also has a bag that goes around the discharge, and I recommend you use that. It keeps dust down. If you're doing these when they're dried out, they're going to have a fair amount of dust. If you're using any of these, you want to use ear protection. You want to use dust protection. I tried using those PPE things that we use for the virus, and they're inadequate. You want to have one of these as your ability to breathe and keeps. I was having lung problems when I was using those other ones. I don't have it when I use one of these. And you need something to protect your eyes. The other thing that you want to use if you're using one, you want to use some kind of a stick to push material in there. You don't want to be holding on to the piece of material that's going to hit the cutter. I was using this center one, and I grabbed a hold of some hydrangea branches and pushed it down. It hit the cutters and it amputated my finger. I sewed it back on, but it's something you don't want to hold on to the material when you're putting it through there. When you're doing this in the space, this is an area that I made out of recycled materials, and I now have glass around this because I have more recycled materials. But I fill up this area, I keep it covered then I was covering it with a tarp. Now it's in a glass cage in there. That lets the material desiccate out. So when I do chip it up in the fall, in this case, I'll come out here and chip it up, and then it's empty, and then I either use it in the garden, and if any left over, then I'll put it in there and let it desiccate till I want to use it. So some concerns, as I mentioned, is your bin selection has to be such that mice and rats, those won't get into it. I've had both rabbits, raccoons, snakes, and crows in there. So you want to have something that makes it so they can't get involved in it. You want to have the location have something that's cosmetic. It's either going to have shrubbery that surrounds it so you can't see it, or a cosmetic bin that fits in with your other decorations. You might be able to do like your first speaker was talking about, and decorate it up, make it fit in that way. Your ability to turn it, if it gets anaerobic, you need to have tines, and I'll show you those in the next slide there. And again, you want to use all those protective things of dust masks, gloves, for ease of turning and transferring. And if you're going to handle this material, wheelbarrows work pretty well. Most of it, when it's chipped up, is fairly light. But if you're going to carry it very far, 5-gallon buckets with the handle work pretty well. Or if it's in a wheelbarrow, you can use 10, because you're going to have to basically throw it into your garden and then kind of rake it into the height you want it to have. At the demo garden, I used one of these large things, and I like D handles. It gives you better control. But if you don't cut it up fine enough, this will carry too much weight. And if you're not fairly strong, you may want to use a smaller one, which will enable you to turn it better. However, I don't have either one of these in my own gardens because I rarely, if ever, turn it. However, if you have a single bin and you don't want to turn it, they make this rotating tine one, which you put in there and you turn it. So if it does become anaerobic, and I've used this a few times where I let it get wet and then it begins to smell, and you can go in and aerate it this way. So this is sort of a last resort tool. But you're going to use one of these to fill your wheelbarrow. So you need one of these depending upon which way you're going to do it. And I recommend a D handle for them. If you're doing kitchen waste, you can buy these ceramic, about a half-gallon. They have a carbon filter in there. There's no smell. They cosmetically look nice. And they also come in stainless steel. And so anything you would normally either put down your disposal or put in your waste, not going to cut up, you put it in here. Then I take it out and I put it in one of those bins that King County used to sell. They don't sell this anymore. They're a sheet of plastic with 4 wing nuts on the side, and they have a top and a bottom. And if you can find them, they work really well, but you can buy one of the smaller ones in there. And you could cut these up if you want it to happen faster, but my wife says that we don't harvest it enough, so she just puts it in there the way it is. You can put coffee grounds in there, and the paper works fine in there. The other thing is I cover it with shredded newspaper. Anything that comes with our name on it that my wife doesn't want to disclose, she grinds up, and so I have a source of shredded newspaper. You can also use coffee sacks. The microorganisms like dark. They don't want to be light. Some you don't want to use are these plasticized labels. The first time I did this, I didn't take those off. And then all these ended up in my garden. So you want to take these off. If you get it hot enough, then you can give these to the King County. That they heat it enough to where they are. You also don't, if you're using shredded paper, you don't want to use one of those that have plasticized. It does the same thing. And again, if you put the shredded newspaper over there, you'll keep down on the gnats and white flies that tend to get into there. Or you can use coffee sacks as another way to keep the light down and those flying critters out of it. Another thing you might want to consider is whether you want to use eggshells. Eggshells are a really good source of calcium. But the first time I did this, my wife was putting all these in there. And when I spread it out in the garden, it looked like it snowed. So I would recommend you don't use eggshells, or sparingly use it, or break them up real fine. When the bin gets full, and I harvest my compost about every other summer in there, what I would do, I wouldn't add paper for a few times when I knew I was going to do it. And then I would take and I would shovel out the top part, and then tip the bin over and scrape the rest out on a tarp on a sunshiny day when I can dry this all out. If you have a lot of worms in the whole thing, you bring it into a pile, scrape off the top part, and take it where you want to use it. And eventually you're going to end up with just a part to have the worms. And then in reality, you're going to end up with all your worms. And if you're a fisherman, it's a good source of bait, but you're going to put that bet back in the bin and use that for the start of the next batch. So in summary, the value and the methods of the equipment here, I recommend you test your soil both chemically and physically. Physically, you can measure it yourself. You just take a tall bottle, some kind of a gallon bottle, you put about a third of it full of the soil, fill it full of water and put in a few drops of detergent, shake it up, and you shake it up for 10 minutes. That's a long time. And then you let it sit. And what settles out in the first minute is your sand. What settles out in the next 3 minutes is your silt. And then you wait about 3 days and see what settles out, and that's your clay. And then you figure the percentages, and you can go look up that triangle and tell you what it are. But if you don't, if you send it to if you have a soil test, they can also tell you that. And in King County, you can get 5 tests, I think every 3 years for free. And I think Snohomish County, where probably some of your people from have, it's called the King Conservation District, but I think it's the Snohomish Conservation District. You pay for it in your taxes in most of those cities. So I check to see if that's available in your area. You want to build your soil before you put in your irrigation system and your all your perennial plants that you don't want to dig up, because it'll take about 3 years of regularly applying compost to the surface before you have a viable soil. If you're doing it like I do, I put in a bunch of ground covers. Now you got to, it's harder to mulch over a bunch of saxifraga. They don't like it. So I would say that if you're just building one, you can use annuals as a ground cover, and you can build your soil. But if you don't, it takes a little bit longer. But it's a bit better to build your soil before you do your planting and your major planting and your I forgot about that. Anyway, the compost process is good for the soil. It's good for your environment, and it's good for your health. If you're turning it, just working in the garden is good for your health. So, but whether it's cost effective is a question you have to decide. If you're going to do it, you want to use protective gear, mask, and goggles. You almost can't do it wrong. It's going to happen no matter what happens. But you can do it easier. So some of you, this is how you're going to do it in either way. So if there's any questions I can answer,